Hi, everyone. It's Cam and Jen from our True Crime Podcast. We've been best friends for over 40 years, and we've been putting out our podcast every Wednesday afternoon for the past 6 years.
Every week, we take you through each case, backed by meticulous research and delivered with absolute respect for the victims and the lives that they impacted.
When you listen, you're really going to feel like you're right at the table, joining in the conversation with us, your witty, lifelong friends.
I mean, after all, this isn't just any true crime podcast. It's our True Crime Podcast. Be sure to follow our True Crime Podcast on your favorite podcast app today.
Some people exaggerate to impress, like claiming they caught a fish this big. Then there's Henry Lee Lucas, who confessed to killing over 600 people. 600. The guy had law enforcement running all over the country trying to connect him to unsolved murders, feeding him burgers like he was some kind of drive-through prophet. But was he America's most prolific serial killer, or just a compulsive liar with a knack for reading the room? Today, we're diving into the life of a man who went from a one-eyed kid in a dirt-poor log cabin to one of the most controversial figures in true crime history. We'll talk about the confessions, the crimes, and about how a task force armed with milkshakes and optimism managed to botch it all. But before we get into that story, if you like your true crime brief and bingeable, you found the right podcast. Tap the follow button now for access to at least 2 episodes per week. Welcome to 10 Minute Murder. I killed him every way there is, except poison. Strangulations, knifings, shootings, hit and runs. I had no feelings for the people themselves. It was just, like I say, as though I left my body, and you just keep stabbing them and imagining that person's not dying. Henry Lee Lucas, the man behind this bone-dry confession of violence, was born in 1936 as the youngest of 9 children. Life in Blacksburg, Virginia wasn't just tough, it was borderline medieval. The Lucas family lived crammed into a single-room log cabin that felt more like a leaky shoebox against the backdrop of harsh Appalachian winters. The patriarch of the fam, Anderson Lucas, had already lost both of his legs in a freight train accident, a detail that earned him the nickname around town, No Legs Lucas. Pause for laughter. Anderson got by selling pencils from a little wagon he'd roll himself around in, though it barely paid for the family's bare necessities. Food and clothes weren't exactly high on the priority list for the Lucas kids, who often showed up to school dirty and barefoot. Obviously, probably hungry as well. Local families stepped in with hand-me-downs and as much as they could afford to give them, but most of Anderson's disability check and those charity donations went straight towards his drinking. He seemed determined to turn drowning sorrows into a full-time job. That left the bulk of the family's survival on the shoulders of Nellie Viola Lucas, Henry's mother. And depending on who you ask, Nellie was either a hard-working mountain woman or a woman with entrepreneurial tendencies, specifically the kind that involved, air quotes, entertaining clients in the middle of that cramped one-room cabin. Either way, survival came at a steep cost for the Lucas children, and Henry's upbringing was shaping into a perfect storm of trauma, poverty, and violence. Henry Lee Lucas's childhood reads like a tragedy no one would believe if it weren't so well documented. By his own accounts, his mother Nellie ruled the family with an iron fist, often resorting to abusive and demeaning behavior. Medical records paint a grim picture of Henry's early years. When he was 8 years old, Nellie beat him so severely with a wooden plank that he ended up in a coma for 3 days. By the time he was 10, a freak accident with his older brother left him with an infection in his left eye. Whether out of neglect or indifference, Nellie refused to seek medical help, allowing that infection to worsen. The final blow came at school, where a teacher disciplined Henry by striking him with a steel-tipped ruler, hitting that infected eye. The damage was so severe that the eye had to be surgically removed and replaced with a glass prosthetic. Adding insult to injury, Nellie reportedly sent Henry to school dressed in girls' clothes during his early years. This cruel act left a lasting scar on him, both emotionally and socially. It wasn't until teachers intervened with complaints and legal action that the practice stopped. Reflecting on his childhood, Henry would later say, quote, "I hated all my life. I hated everybody. When I first grew up and can remember, I was dressed as a girl by my mother, and it stayed that way for 2 or 3 years. After that, I was treated like what I would call the dog of the family. I was beaten. I was made to do things that no human being would ever want to do." End quote. The hardships didn't end with his abusive mother. Around the age of 14, Henry lost his father, Anderson, under bleak circumstances. Anderson, who had already endured a lifetime of hardship after losing both of his legs in that train accident, was found outside the house after a night spent in the cold. Some say he succumbed to pneumonia after drinking too much, while others believe he deliberately distanced himself from the chaos inside the home. Following his father's death, Henry began drifting through Virginia, engaging in petty crimes and struggling to find stability. This aimless wandering marked the beginning of a life steeped in violence and lawlessness. In 1954, Henry was arrested for a spree of burglaries and sentenced to 4 years in prison. It was his first documented brush with the law, but certainly not his last. Henry Lee Lucas claimed that his killing spree began in 1951 while drifting through Virginia. According to his accounts, his first victim was 17-year-old Laura Everline Burnsley. Lucas alleged that he kidnapped Laura after she rejected him, took her to a wooded area, and killed her when she resisted his advances. However, no physical evidence or remains of Laura have ever been found to support this claim. After serving time for burglary and being released in 1959, Lucas moved to Michigan to live with his half-sister, Opal Retta Jennings. He began rebuilding his life and even planned to marry a pen pal he had written to from prison. Those plans crumbled when his 71-year-old mother, Nellie Lucas, arrived for the holidays and discovered her son's intentions. Nellie disapproved, insisting that Henry abandon his plans and return to Virginia to care for her instead. What followed was a toxic cocktail of old grudges and alcohol-fueled arguments. On January 11th, 1960, witnesses saw Henry and Nellie drinking and arguing at a local bar. Back at home, things escalated when Nellie allegedly struck Henry with a broom. According to Henry, he retaliated, slapping her, and the altercation ended with her collapsing. He later recounted, "All I remember was slapping her alongside the neck. Then I noticed my knife in my hand, and she'd been cut." Nellie's death was officially ruled as a heart attack, exacerbated by the physical fight. Henry fled, but he was arrested shortly after in Ohio. He claimed self-defense, but the courts were not convinced. Convicted of second-degree murder, he received a 40-year prison sentence, but served only 10 due to overcrowding. After his release, Henry's criminal activities escalated. He was convicted of attempting to kidnap a 15-year-old girl and served another 5 years. Upon this release, he drifted again, marrying briefly and living with a cousin's widow, who later accused him of abusing her daughters. Lucas then moved to Jacksonville, Florida, where he met Otis Toole at a soup kitchen, a meeting that would cement their infamy. Henry and Otis quickly became close, moving in together with Otis's mother and 11-year-old niece, Frida Becky Powell. During this time, they appeared to maintain stable jobs, but Henry later claimed that they were carrying out multi-state killing sprees, targeting vulnerable individuals like hitchhikers, sex workers, and the homeless. According to Lucas, Otis had a particular penchant for dismemberment, and Lucas alleged that his accomplice sometimes consumed parts of their victims. These claims remain largely unverified. Henry's life took another dark turn when he began a relationship with Becky Powell, who was just 15 years old and intellectually disabled. Knowing the relationship would land Henry back in prison, the pair of them fled Florida. A minister in Texas, mistaking them for a struggling married couple, provided them with an apartment and helped Henry find work. But Becky's homesickness soon led to friction. Lucas claimed that he left her at a truck stop to make her own way back to Florida. Later, he told law enforcement a much darker story. He had killed Becky, assaulted her post-mortem, dismembered her body, and scattered her remains in a field. He also confessed to killing their elderly roommate, disposing of her body in the same field. Investigators did find human remains in the area, but identification proved inconclusive. Once in custody, Lucas claimed that he was subjected to harsh conditions, including isolation and freezing temperatures, until he confessed. And confess he did, starting with Becky, his mother, and Laura Burnsley. Encouraged by Texas Rangers, who reportedly treated him to burgers and milkshakes while reviewing unsolved cases, Lucas confessed to over 600 murders nationwide. His confessions became increasingly absurd. Investigative journalists at the Dallas Times-Herald uncovered that for Henry's claims to be true, he would have needed to drive over 11,000 miles in a month without stopping to sleep, a logistical impossibility. Despite glaring inconsistencies, Henry was convicted of 11 murders, including Becky's, his mother's, and a Jane Doe known as Orange Socks. Notably, Lucas had an alibi for the Orange Socks case. His work punch card showed that he was on the clock at the time of her murder. Sentenced to death, Lucas's penalty was later commuted to life in prison after widespread doubt arose about his confessions. He died in 2001 of natural causes, leaving behind a legacy clouded by lies, manipulation, and so many unanswered questions. The math never mathed. It was simply impossible for Henry Lee Lucas to have committed the hundreds of murders he confessed to. Even Henry himself later admitted as much, recanting all but one of his confessions, the murder of his mother. Lucas left behind a legacy as polarizing as it is perplexing. To some, he remains a boogeyman of unfathomable evil, a man capable of killing with the casualness of flipping a light switch. To others, he was a deeply disturbed individual with a penchant for fabricating grandiose lies, exploited by a law enforcement team more interested in closing cases than uncovering the truth. Either way, one thing is certain. Few criminal cases in American history have been as shrouded in myth and manipulation as the strange saga of Henry Lee Lucas and his peculiar fondness for milkshakes. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for listening. And hey, if you're a new listener and you're into stories like this, ones that make you question everything, including your faith and humanity, make sure you hit subscribe and leave a review. Or don't, I'm not here to nag, but it does help me keep digging into the madness for you. I have a website, and you are more than welcome to go to it, 10minutemurder.com. There's all kinds of stuff there. I'm not going to go into detail about everything that you will find there, but there's a bunch, 10minutemurder.com. Also, if you're a listener to this podcast, you want to keep up to date with what's happening, not just with the podcast, but like with true crime cases around the country and around the world. You can follow me on social media. Links for that are also at 10minutemurder.com. And if you just want to send me an email, touch base with me for whatever reason, joe@10minutemurder.com. That's my email address. And that's going to do it. That is your episode for today. Thanks for sticking around, and if you're off to binge more episodes, don't let me stop you. Keep right on cooking. Thank you again for listening to 10-Minute Murder.